Hey everyone, I'm Austin Hankwitz, and this is After Earnings, the show from Morning Brew and Stakeholder Labs that brings investors up close and personal with the executives behind the world's most interesting public companies.
And I'm Katy Perry. Today we're chatting with Swimmy Minami, billionaire tech entrepreneur and partial owner of the New York Yankees. Swimmy founded and is CEO of the HR tech company Visional, which lists on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. They were recently upgraded from growth distinction to prime just a few months ago, sort of like getting uplisted on the NASDAQ here in the U.S.
We talk about how he's building the Japanese LinkedIn, his 15-year journey as a global entrepreneur, becoming an LP of the New York Yankees, as well as his recent recognition as being inducted to EY's World Entrepreneur of the Year class of 2024.
And obviously, we're going to talk about baseball a bit, so let's get into it.
Swimmy Minami, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this episode of After Earnings. I'm so excited to jump into things.
Great. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So Visional is an HR technology company, which means you're in the business of identifying, recruiting, and retaining talent. But these days, a lot of focus is on the technology and maybe not necessarily the people who power it. So tell us maybe about the risk of not being great at human capital and what Visional's technology does to help companies mitigate that risk.
You know, this is 2024, so there's always going to be a good hybrid between human capital, the actual human, and the technology itself. You know, we try to bridge that gap for companies to have a good balance on how to run a good company. It all starts, you know, our business started by being the first career networking service. We're often called the Japanese LinkedIn, by connecting employers with professionals in terms of recruiting. So we're more of a single purpose kind of platform where employers and professionals connect to find each other. So it is kind of like a job site, but in a more open platform way, specifically focused in Japan. You know, our big difference came when we started going internally. We took a lot of the technology we had on the recruiting platform. For example, we have a patent for AI generating resume builder or an AI generating kind of job description builder, where the AI using GPT technology creates resumes using market data of supply and demand between the employer and professional. And we've taken all that technology and we've allowed companies to use that in terms of talent management and performance. So, for example, I have a 2,000 person company. I have a certain project and I want someone like Rachel for this project. The technology will help us go search through our internal database of personnel to try to match and find the perfect person that is kind of like Rachel. And if we cannot find that person internally, the search will continue onto my career networking platform to find that perfect person externally. And so we're kind of like the first platform or service where we combine a job site and a talent management platform. So it's kind of like an external job site and an internal job site coming together as one. So that's what we are.
Swimmy, as a quick aside, and we want to dig deeper into the product, I'm curious,
Sure.
You know, you call yourself LinkedIn of Japan. Is the posting style similar in Japan as the U.S.? There's this inside joke in the U.S. that some people, they're posting on LinkedIn, it's a little cringe, and there's like a unique style. Does that exist in Japan, or is that a uniquely American phenomenon?
Yeah, you know, LinkedIn does exist in Japan, and they're a great service. I love LinkedIn personally, but it's a more grander or more broad value proposition in the sense that they want to connect professionals globally, and not just through recruiting, but through their regular business activities. You know, we're a single purpose one, so we don't have postings and we don't have any other, motivation other than employers finding professionals and professionals finding employers for a job search process. So we're more closer to a job site than what actually LinkedIn is. And that's what differentiated us going into the market 15 years ago, because I think the delicacy towards personal information in the East Asian countries like Japan and Korea is much more than in the Western world. And people didn't want to blast everything that they experience and what they want to talk about onto the internet, like our Western counterparts.
That was a classy response, but based on that, I'm going to sign up because it's too much. But you guys were founded 15 years ago, and it's interesting to think about being in HR tech over the last decade plus. All these conversations now ramping up on fears of automation and AI and job replacement. And, you have the cynics saying, oh my God, it's going to replace all our jobs. And then you have optimists saying, no, it's going to create more opportunity and change so like people need to be able to use the technology, but it's not necessarily going to replace them. And I'm wondering, what do you think about all that general societal conversation, being someone who's building in the middle of it all right now?
Yeah. I'm a big student of history, and I think we've gone through a lot of changes similar over hundreds and hundreds of years, technological, developments, right? I'm sure when cars came out, people who were, providing horse riding services got very scared that they would lose their jobs and so on and so forth. I think, as humans, we're never going to know what's going to happen in the future. And that's why that makes our race, or that's what makes humans interesting. So to be honest with you, I'm not a predictor of the future, but I'm very optimistic that technology will lead us to something new. And as humans, we'll figure it out. And I'm an optimist on that.
Awesome.
I appreciate that answer. And, kind of back to what you were giving as an example with Rachel, right? Let's say you had a big project coming up and you would sort of lean into this technology that you've built to identify who the person is specifically that can get that job done best. And if you can't find them in your own organization, you'll go recruit them externally. So I'm curious, talk to me about the privacy around that. Maybe, how do you know Rachel might be a good candidate for this project? How did you guys kind of build that from the ground up while also keeping employee privacy as well as maybe skill sets and things like that in mind?
Sure. We started off with our career networking service where there is a supply and demand, where the professional actually, similar to LinkedIn, wants to put as much information they want into the database. Obviously, the AI really helped us even push that further by helping professionals write their resume. I think a lot of professionals have trouble writing their resume, and by using market data and trying to help them and ask the right questions that they want answered, right? And once that happened, we started going internally. Now, it's a different ballgame with external kind of job matching, with internal job matching. We don't, have other people access other companies' data. But the company itself, when they're trying to find someone, they'll use the internal data, performance review, attendance, one-on-one. The AI will eat a lot of the data that happens internally between the employer or in between the company and their employee. And when the company starts writing up their job description, or when the company wants to find someone similar, the technology will help find patterns between certain individuals within the company to match. And because we're using the same technology and the same kind of data sets that for internal search, and also that technology came from the external search itself, we're aligned in the sense that the company can use similar questions or the same kind of data sets to find the right people that matches what they want.
I think that makes a ton of sense. I appreciate the walkthrough there. So now kind of moving on to the meat and potatoes of the interview. Visional's listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, right? This is one of the world's largest marketplaces for securities. Now, for my U.S. investors, you may be able to even access some of these international stocks like Visional on the OTC markets over the counter. Now, listing from the growth market on Japanese exchange to the prime market. Can you talk to me about that? I think us U.S. investors might not exactly know the differences there, including myself. So I'm eager to hear how you were able to sort of transform and really evolve into that new listing.
Yeah, I mean, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, they've kind of rearranged their sections in the last 12, 18 months. But when we did list in 2021, about 3 years ago, the growth market is kind of like the small cap market, where the preconditions to list is much lower than the prime section, which is what it's called now. Obviously the governance and the compliance and even the liquidity figures to relist onto the prime market, which is kind of like the real market. I mean, both the prime market and the growth market are real, public markets. But I think the conditions to list on the two markets are a little bit different. It's a little bit more difficult for the prime. So the Japanese companies that my American friends know, the Toyotas, the Yamahas, the Hondas, the Sonys, they're all prime listed companies. And as we grew as a public company, we passed certain thresholds or certain parameters that is needed to become a prime listed company, which happened last December. So we're happy to be listed in the major league market of the Tokyo Stock Exchange.
Most definitely. So it's kind of like getting uplisted to the NASDAQ, or maybe even getting added to the S&P 500 or something like that, right? Very clear parameters.
Very similar. Very similar.
Gotcha. Very cool.
Exactly.
Congratulations.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like a major move. I'm curious, here in the U.S., as we sit and talk, we're fully amid roaring kitty, meme stocks raging back. Retail investing is hotter than it was in 2021. How can you articulate what the retail investor appetite and market looks like in Japan? Is there that same push towards democratizing access to the public markets? Are there similarities or differences between what we see here in the U.S.?
It's quite similar. Obviously, the U.S. is the world leader, especially in financial markets, and a lot of the secondary markets. The Tokyo Stock Exchange is one of the major secondary markets. In line with the London Stock Exchange. We follow similar patterns. Obviously, obviously the Tokyo Stock Exchange mainly lists Japanese companies, and most non-Japanese companies aren't traded on that market. So obviously we'll have demographic differences, but all in all, I think the U.S., the NASDAQ, or the New York Stock Exchange is the leader in change and innovation in terms of the trends and movements of financial markets or the stock exchanges. So I think the Japanese market, follows the U.S. market very closely.
Interesting. I want to pivot to some of your earnings updates that were recently shared, reporting 19% year-over-year revenue growth. Walk us through what the core drivers were there. Was it current client expanding to new products? I know your human capital management platform has some pretty high growth. Or is it, net new customers? What really do you attribute that growth to?
Sure. I think that the biggest driver for us is that here's an interesting figure for my American friends, right? Is that in Japan, the average turnover for full-time employees in Japan annually is 2.5%.
Wow.
So if you have a 100-person company, full-time employees, only 2.5 people leave the company each year.
So they're not job hopping.
Well, and it's tripled in the last 10 years. So,
oh my gosh, that's some loyalty right there. You guys have some great leadership.
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of change. Obviously, if if a full-time employee changes a job every 5 years, that's probably between like 15-20% turnover a year, right? So we still have Japan has been very good at retaining employees. We have a social system of lifelong employment, and it's a little bit more difficult to fire people. Whether that's good or not, it's a different story. But Japan is changing, especially with the younger generation becoming more westernized and more open to changing companies. So for us, that is the biggest kind of driver in terms of our job platform. That's the platform we changed. That's the job platform that we started 15 years ago. So a huge chunk of our profits is coming from the career networking service and the transactions that happen there. So when everyone moves, we're the biggest kind of intersection for professionals. So every time someone moves, we make money. So that macroeconomic change inside inside our country has been our biggest driver. Now, when people start leaving companies needs to start hiring new people. And when that happens, the management of companies start losing track of what kinds of people, what kind of skills, experiences exist in our company through their employees. And that's when they need to start managing talent. Because, for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, each Japanese company knew exactly what type of people or employees they had in the company because there's not much job change happening in the country. So our human capital, cloud platform, which is called Harmas, is our main driver, driving our growth, 60, 70% a year. And I've talked to investors about this. This is a 10-year play. Because the phenomenon in job change and talent management is just starting in Japan. And, external transactions are going to naturally shift up. 2.5% isn't sustainable. It's something that will rise and increase over the years. And when that happens, the internal management of talent and human capital will need to pick up. And, we're right in the thick of things right there.
That is so interesting. Katie, my mind is blown right now. I did not know that so little people, I'm just thinking about myself, and I'm sure a ton of other people listening right now who are in their perhaps 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s. Like I can count on, two hands how many different job opportunities and times I wanted to, quit this or try this or do that. Wow, that's such a cultural just difference that I wasn't aware of. It's
cultural difference. Yeah, Japan's the size of California. Geographically, and has 125 million people. Wow. It's about 35, 40% GDP all of U.S. So it's a big country economically, but it's a slow giant trying to change. Like maybe people forget in the 1980s, the U.S. was a lifelong employment-based society, right? There was not much job mobility.
Things like that, yeah.
Exactly, because it was a manufacturing-based country in terms of, economic, from a business perspective as a whole country. And as the U.S. moved from manufacturing to more services, the job market liquidated and people started changing jobs. And that's what Japan is going through. Toyota, for the first time ever in 2023, the number of hires they had laterally for the first time in decades surpassed new graduate hires from college.
Wow.
Yeah. It seems like such a strong narrative to take to investors in the market that you're playing both sides of the trend, the offense and the defense, and serving both. So essentially you built like a marketplace where as that trend goes up, you can see upside on both sides of that.
Oh, definitely. I get a lot of comments and prompts and advice from investors because we're probably one of the very few kind of I would just call it a job site that owns a talent management suite inside a company. We play both sides. We try to help companies retain talent. We try to help companies match talent internally. If they can't find that person internally, they can go externally to find that perfect fit outside the company. So I think the name of the game is data and analytics. And and this all came because my last job I was working for an expansion professional baseball team in Japan. And Moneyball played a big part in changing the sport of baseball through data and analytics. And Moneyball 2.0 now is about training and development and trying to help players become better at the major league level. And through that, I truly believe that there's a lot of analogies. Obviously, baseball, you're playing with much fewer parameters, and the end game is very similar in the sense that you want to score more runs and prevent runs, and companies in business have much more parameters than baseball itself. But I think we're playing with the same parameters, right? In the sense that companies want higher profit, they want innovation, what kind of players, what kind of employers do they want in their companies? And the data and the analytics is going to help them find that right person that fits their company.
Well, speaking of innovation and profits, you noted, and I quote, to increase mid to long-term enterprise value, we are creating businesses in growth areas other than HR technology. Can you walk us through what that means? Some of these big ideas you might be working on, or just any actual products and services that can come from the statement?
Yeah. Since, we provide a lot of B2B services, whether it's recruitment, talent management, performance, and HR, obviously as we grow our ecosystem with our main HCM businesses, we run into a lot of issues, right? For example, security governance issues with our platforms. We run into problems. And when we can't find a solution that we like, we actually try to incubate businesses off of the issues or problems that we face through our business development. So we're very, heavy investing into cybersecurity, especially on the security governance side here in Japan. Security scorecard stuff, governance stuff, supply chain, you name it. And these are some of the areas that we're investing in because, we see issues everywhere around our businesses. And when clients can't find a solution elsewhere, they actually come to us because, they're hiring to find solutions in their businesses, respective businesses. And we're trying to find people for them externally to kind of provide the service or provide the solution for them. So we know a lot of the issues and problems that our clients face in Japan. And when we hear about that, then as a developer of incubator of a lot of businesses in Japan, we attack and try to businesses that fit the solution that our clients want.
I love the call out about cybersecurity. I think that's very, very smart, right? I mean, at the end of the day, as AI gets, stronger and all these other different supercomputers, things like that, right? Cybersecurity is it's never going away. We'll always need cybersecurity. So I think that's a very smart move.
Yeah, as we go into the cloud, as we're more mobile, as more data is being produced, defense is going to be the name of the game. Yeah, and I truly believe that as owner of a lot of personal data on our platforms, that we need to be very careful. And the best way to be most careful is by having a cybersecurity business and being very keen on that area to protect our respective businesses.
Swimmy, it was interesting to hear you articulate, if something doesn't exist in the market or it's not up to standards for you or your customers, you're seemingly, we'll build it, we'll find it, we'll incubate it. And we recently had the CFO of ServiceNow on, big IT tech company, and she was saying the same things where customers go to them because they know they can build great products and they'll ask for something and that becomes an extension of the business. So I think there's a lot of similarities there.
ServiceNow is a great company. We use them in Japan, and a lot of similarities, right? Because we're facing our clients and customers, and they always have issues and problems. And whether we create that or incubate that organically, or whether that's through M&A, is for us to pursue. We're never going to stop figuring out what the best solutions are for our clients.
Awesome. And we heard you recently had some exciting news. You're in the EY World Entrepreneur of the Year class of 2024. Congratulations. That's major. And I'm curious, in your mind, as you think about accolades like this and the group of people you're listed among, what do you think the main traits are that are separating the leading entrepreneurs and CEOs today versus maybe things that might have been more important in the past?
So, I'm joining you from Monaco, where the where the EY World Entrepreneur Awards are being held, and it's a great setting. To answer your question directly and indirectly, the key is to understand what's happening around the world, not just in your industry, not just in your country, and it's about learning. I think a lot of my, not colleagues, but the other winners from different countries, from over 45 countries in the world, we learn from each other. And the biggest trait that the best entrepreneurs have is the constant learning, the constant relearning, unlearning process, that you're never going to stand still, and you have to continue learning from each other. And, I travel a lot to different countries to meet a lot of other entrepreneurs in different areas, because there's a lot of similarities on how to incubate and how you grow a new business. And the best way to learn is to get primary information from the entrepreneurs themselves. And the EY awards, the accolade is fun in itself, but the learning is the most important thing that I'm going to take back from Monaco. How do other companies grow? How do other companies in other parts of the world try to change or digitally transform themselves? What are other older entrepreneurs thinking about as they go through their journey? So these are some of the things that I always try to take back. It's not just about the business. It's about being sustainable, and it's about trying to know the world in a different angle. And this is what I think the EY Entrepreneur of the Year awards are all about. It's about diversity and trying to learn from each other.
What a powerful perspective, Swimmy. I really appreciate that. And I completely agree. I'm curious, I'm sure there are countless entrepreneurs listening to this episode right now that are inspired by your story, inspired by this recent award. What piece of advice would you give them as they try and now perhaps learn more about the world as it relates to their business for the very first time, right? How do they take that first step? Is it to literally travel? Is it to how do they do that?
The easiest way, one, is to try to see if there's anyone else in the world trying to do what you're doing. In a lot of cases, I see that people look just around them in their own country. But in actuality, especially with new businesses using digital technology, the world moves so fast. And similar issues pop up in different countries everywhere. And be certain that there is at least 100 entrepreneurs around the world that are trying to do what you're doing. And try to find that person online. And when you do find that person, ping them. Whether it's through LinkedIn, whether it's through any other social media measures, X, Facebook, you name it, Instagram, just ping the other person and have a conversation. And most likely, you'll find that person interesting. Most likely, you'll want to meet them personally. Just fly to their country and city and have a conversation. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15, 20 years, not with my current business, but also with the baseball team that I helped build in Japan. I went to meet a lot of sporting teams around the world, not just in the U.S., but in the U.K., not just baseball, but basketball, football. MLS was starting back then, Major League Soccer in the U.S. And you learn a lot by trying to meet other entrepreneurs or other businesses that are doing something similar in a different country.
Great segue, Swimmy, because we know we only have a few more minutes left to you, and then you're going to go do Monaco things, which I'm sure are amazing. But yeah, you're a limited partner of one of the most renowned sports organizations anywhere. And I'm curious, what is the job of a limited partner? I know, especially the Yankees, you got the Steinbrenners. Is it sort of like if you're at a startup and there's a bunch of investors and they're being helpful, or what value are you bringing, and kind of what does the day-to-day of that look like?
It's more about smiling and having a good time more than anything. Obviously, I tried to be different because I am the, first Japanese kind of limited partner of the organization. And I'm very grateful for the Steinbrenners and all the other limited partners who've allowed me to join the club. Obviously, when I get a lot of questions, not just on the baseball side, especially with all these influx of Japanese players coming into the U.S., it'll be more about business, digital strategy, and so on and so forth. So, it's more about having fun. But if there is that, occasional question that pops up that I can contribute, I'm more than willing to help.
Amazing.
I think that is awesome. Now, here's the real question. If you were starting a new team from scratch and you have the universe of every MLB player ever at your disposal, who are you picking first and why?
Wow, that is a good question. And I know what answer you want me to answer with, right? Obviously the greatest player at MLB right now, the reigning MVP of the American League, happens to be a Japanese player named Shohei Ohtani. And Ohtani's, he's great. And he's a unicorn in the sense that he went against everything that baseball stood for decades and decades and decades. And that is to specialize in something that you're good at, whether that was hitting or throwing the ball. And he went against it. And that's what I hopefully believe that every entrepreneur can take back, that every entrepreneur is original, that every entrepreneur has a reason why they're an entrepreneur, and just believe in yourself. And because I want you to be successful when you're successful, meaning that I want you to be happy when you're successful, because a lot of times entrepreneurs throw away a lot of stuff to be successful, but you're not happy when you do that. You have to be yourself. You have to try to be happy when you're successful with your business, and never forget that, because it is a big thing.
I love that.
I got to get in there and ask the question that's on all of New Yorkers' minds. I live a couple stops from Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
Who is your least favorite Red Sox of all time? Like, who is just bottom of the barrel? I know it's hard to pick a favorite worst Red Sox, but do you have anyone in mind?
Well, the obvious name that pops up is Pedro, right? Yeah. We love Pedro, but we hate Pedro.
Yeah.
And, it's a love-hate relationship with the Red Sox all the time. And you know what? I think this is the year, 2024, when we take home the trophy. And we have a big parade in the city. And I'm looking forward to it together with my friends in the organization.
Hell yeah, let's go. You heard it here first. We're taking it this year. Go. Thank you so much for joining us today from
I just want to thank you guys and EY and this tremendous opportunity to talk to your listeners, because it's very, not every day you get to speak to global listeners around the world about my story and our company. And I look forward to everyone in the stock market, 4194 on the Tokyo Stock Exchange.
I love it. Thank you so much, Swimmy. Have a great rest of your week.
Great. Thank you.
What an awesome interview we just had with Swimmy. Massive shout out to him and his team for letting him hang out with us on this episode of After Earnings. I think that was my first actual conversation with a legitimate billionaire. That was so cool. So here's my biggest takeaway from the interview. Japan's workforce is clearly changing. They're no longer these employees who are working at a single company for the entirety of their lives, especially the younger folks, right? The younger workforce there. So, they're beginning to kind of explore the idea of job hopping, something us Americans are very familiar with, so that when they're working at a company, it better aligns with maybe their work-life balance, maybe some long-term financial goals, things like that. So it seems like Swimmy's building a company that is kind of empowering these job hoppers to find their next best opportunity, as well as the employers to sort of fill those positions, right? And it's kind of crazy. He shared that statistic of that 2.5% kind of attrition rate, right? So 2.5% of the workforce in Japan are actually leaving their jobs on an annual basis. I did some research. That number is 47% in the United States. So the investment thesis for me is pretty simple. If I think that 2.5% will begin to incrementally inch higher toward the United States' 47% over the next however many years, this is a company that I'm interested in.
Yeah, what a wild stat. I mean, DM's clearly open here in the U.S., beginning to open in Japan. And what's also interesting is sort of how he's playing both sides of that trend, both empowering those job hoppers to connect with the companies and roles they want, but also building human analytics software so companies can de-risk and understand things like if their star performers might be disengaged and things like that. We also talked baseball. He's partial owner of the Yankees. No big deal. We got him to admit his least favorite Red Sox, which was surprisingly not Kevin Youkilis. I really thought we were all on the same page with that. Guess not. Also, I think he might have invited me to the owner's suite at the Yankee game, unless he was just being polite, which I'm going to assume is no, and that was an actual invite. And with that, this was the After Earnings show brought to you by Morning Brew and Stakeholder Labs.
Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with a friend, and we'll catch you next time.